Let's open up to Romans 14, and we'll work our way through what God has to say to us today in this wonderful chapter. One of the things I've said all along in the book of Romans is that the book of Romans from 12 to the end, as you recall, is Paul's practical applications to the Christian life. And we already talked about how Romans 1 through 5 is sort of his big case for justification by faith alone, and then 6 through 11 is all the objections he deals with from, well, now can I live however I want, and what about Israel, and so on. We've done all that. And then 12 through the end, and I keep reminding you of this structure, right? So that when the book of Romans is over, you're not thinking, I just know a few passages. You ought to know the whole book. At the end of the book of Romans, Paul goes into all his practical stuff. And today, he hits one of the most practical things you can think of. And it's very simple, kind of scary, but all very relevant, and that is simply this. Paul's going to talk about how Christians disagree with each other. What happens when we don't get along? What happens when you think someone's wrong about something, and they think you're wrong about something in terms of how you live or what you think? What do you do in certain circumstances like that? Now, when you hear that, you're thinking to yourself, wow, that sounds pretty relevant, right? Maybe you've had a disagreement with a Christian recently about how to live, what to be like, what Christians should do and think. And if you think about our world today, that's a pretty big issue. Now, Paul's not going to address everything about that issue. He's going to take one little sliver of it, but you can see today this is going to be a really important topic. So let's have a look today and find out what God has to say to us. Romans chapter 14, we're going to be looking at verses 1 through 12. Let's listen and see what God has to say to us today. As for the one who is weak in faith, welcome him, but not to quarrel over opinions. One person believes he may eat anything, while the weak person eats only vegetables. Let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains, and let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats, for God has welcomed him. Who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another? It is before his own master that he stands or falls, and he will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make him stand. One person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. The one who observes the day observes it in honor of the Lord. The one who eats in honor of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God. While the one who abstains in honor of the Lord and gives thanks to God. For none of us lives to himself, and none of us dies to himself. For if we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. So then, whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. For to this end Christ died and lived again, that he might be Lord of both the dead and of the living. Why do you pass judgment on your brother? Or why do you despise your brother? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God, for it is written, As I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall confess to God. So then, each of us will give an account of himself to God. It's a misunderstood passage in the Bible, in my opinion, and I hear a lot about this from people. In all the times I speak and preach and teach at churches, I hear people say things about the Bible and make comments about things and so on. And I think by far and away the most misunderstood passage of Scripture is going to be, do not judge, lest you be judged. I would venture to say that not only have I heard that misunderstood by believers, but I've particularly heard that passage misunderstood by non-believers, by non-Christians. In fact, and sometimes I think maybe the only passage they know in the Bible. I'll sit on an airplane and I'll talk to somebody who's not a Christian, and we talk about spiritual things, and they'll say, hey, well, the Bible says do not judge. And I'm like, that seems to be the one passage everybody knows. But yet it's grossly and vastly and enormously misunderstood. In fact, right here, what we find in Paul's passage in Romans 14 is he actually corrects, and rightly lays out what that really does mean. And let me begin first by telling you what it doesn't mean. Paul does not mean by do not judge, nor does Jesus mean when he says do not judge, that you can't ever tell someone what they're doing is wrong. We have this idea that when it says do not judge, you can't ever go to someone, especially a fellow believer, and say, hey, you really ought to stop that behavior. Well, you can't do that, someone says, because that's judging me, and you shouldn't judge. That's the perception in the world about what that means, but that's not what Paul means, and that's not what Jesus means. What Paul is going to teach us is when he's talking about not judging someone, he means don't hold up your own personal, private standard and hold them to it. You need to only hold them to the standard in the Word of God, not something that you yourself have come up with. So here's the thing you need to realize about the passage today, and it's really critical if you're going to get it. When Paul is talking about disagreements, When Paul's talking about judging one another, he's only dealing with the narrow issue of matters that the Bible does not speak to one way or the other. Okay? You might call these neutral things or disputable matters. We'll get into that in a moment. But what's happening in Rome is that some people are insisting things are wrong that aren't. It's that simple. Some people think, that behavior over there is wrong, and Paul comes in and goes, actually, they think it's wrong. It isn't. They're the weaker brother. I'll say more about that in a moment. And that's what you call a disputable matter. So what you have to realize this morning is that when Paul's talking about disagreements here, he's talking only about issues the Bible doesn't speak to. So he's going to clarify what it means to judge or not to judge. And once again, let me be clear. No one in the Bible, not Paul, not Jesus, anyone, ever says, hey, you can't tell someone that their behavior is wrong. No. Paul does that all the time. Jesus does that all the time. He even calls Christians to do that in certain situations. What we're talking about here is when you take your own private, personal standards and force it on someone else. To put it even more bluntly, what Paul's talking about today is when you add things to the Bible that aren't there, and then you make it clear to someone that they ought to follow that thing you've added. And Paul's point is going to be very simple. Wait a second. You can't just add things to the Bible and then enforce it on people. That would be judging them on your standards and not on God's. And that's exactly where we're going to go today. So as you think about judging other people, this is going to be huge for you today. This is going to be a transformative, game-changing thing for you to think about what it really means to judge someone versus the misconception in our world and maybe even in our own minds about what it means to judge somebody. So look at your outline. Let's talk about what we're going to do today. First, we're going to talk about just what is meant by disputable matters. This first Roman numeral there, we're going to talk about that Christians will disagree over things, and it's inevitable. And then on the back of your page, we're going to talk about how to respond to these disagreements and how to handle them. Here's where Paul gives 3 really practical tidbits of advice that I'm going to pass along to you today. They're going to be really critical for how you handle these types of disputes in your Christian life. But let's start with the first Roman numeral there. Christians will disagree over disputable matters. Here's the first thing I want you to realize before we even dive into the nitty-gritty of this passage. I want you to realize that Paul actually even brings this up at all. The fact that he even mentions this. Think about all the things he could bring up in Romans. He's talking about the practical Christian life. And what does he decide to do? He says, I got a limited amount of things I can talk about, and I want to talk about Christians not getting along. That tells you something, doesn't it? It tells you that when you live the Christian life, there's going to be times when you don't get along with your fellow believers, and you have what's called disputes or disagreements, doctrinal sort of conflict and things like this. Paul knows that's going to happen. So he's taking time out of his valuable epistle to address that issue. That alone tells you something. They should expect this. It's sort of part of the fallen world we live in, and you've got to have some ability to deal with and have a category for how to deal with that. However, Paul's not talking just about any disagreement, as I said from the start. He's talking about a certain kind. Disagreements over things the Scripture does not speak to one way or the other. And this is what I'm calling, this is my terminology, disputable matters. And you can see how I put it in Roman numeral 1 there. Christians will disagree over these disputable matters. So what is a disputable matter? Look at point A. I'm going to define it for you. A disputable matter is an issue or a disagreement over an issue that the Bible does not forbid. Look at the language I use there. This refers to a practice or activity that the Bible does not forbid, but that some Christians are nevertheless uncomfortable with. Let me put it just more bluntly. This refers to things that some people think are wrong that aren't. It's just that simple. There's going to be some Christians that think a certain behavior is wrong, and it's actually not wrong, but they insist that it is wrong. That's the type of issue we're dealing with here, okay? Is the type of issue where people misunderstand what's forbidden or what's required, and they insist on a certain path, and that's not exactly what the Bible says. So this is what we mean by disputable matters. The Bible doesn't forbid an activity, but some Christians, nevertheless, are the type of Christians who insist that that activity is wrong. And Paul has a name for that kind of Christian. You're probably not going to like it, especially if you think it applies to you, right? The name that Paul has for that Christian is a weak Christian. Look down at verse 1 with me for a moment. You'll see how he begins this. As for the one who is weak in faith. Now, here's the thing about people who fit this category. They often don't know they fit this category. No one in the back says, oh, that's me. I'm the weak brother, right? Or I'm the weak sister. No, Paul is objectively from the outside saying, but there are some in your midst that are in this category. And by the way, he uses this language in other letters. He uses this in Corinthians and other places, the weak and the strong. The same sort of idea Paul picks up here in Romans that he picks up in other places. So what does he mean by the weak brother? Well, let me just lay out one thing he doesn't mean. You can see I put it there. Paul does not use this term in a pejorative sense. He's not talking about that they have weak faith in Christ or that they're barely a Christian or something like this. When Paul talks about the weaker brother, he's not saying, well, those people over there, they're just barely Christians. They have just a little bit of faith in Christ. No, that's not what he's saying. He's not talking about how much faith they have or whether they're really saved. These are people who are really saved, people who really love Jesus, and they may have a rich, robust faith. When he says they're weak in faith, that's not what he means. What does Paul mean? Look at the way I say it there. Instead, Paul uses weak because these believers lack understanding or maturity to realize their freedom in Christ. In other words, they think something's wrong when it isn't. And therefore, they lack a certain level of understanding, a certain level of maturity that makes them bothered by something, okay? Upset by a certain behavior that's not wrong, but they think it's wrong, and Paul then calls them the weaker brother. You could say these are, another phrase I like to use when I describe this, these are, what instead of calling them weak brothers, I would say overly sensitive brothers or sisters is another way to say this, okay? When I say overly sensitive, I don't mean emotionally. I mean in terms of practices or activities. They're bothered by things, okay? They find that offensive. They find that problematic. It's not actually sinful, but they find it problematic or bothersome. Now, when you hear all that, you're thinking, but why does Paul bring this up at all? He's writing a letter to Rome. Why bring up this little micro issue about people who think things are wrong, but they really aren't? Here's the answer. No doubt, and scholars pretty much agree on this, no doubt what's going on in Rome is there's a number of people who used to be Jews who converted to Christianity. And as soon as they become Christians, they realize that their fellow believers, many of which are Gentiles, are not following the laws they used to follow as Jews. There's Jews who've become Christians who used to know certain things were wrong. And in the Old Testament, God did forbid them for Jews, okay? And one of the things is that, look, in the Old Testament, God had set up food laws. You can't eat certain kinds of food. You can't eat these kinds of food. And then when Christ comes, those purity laws are fulfilled in him and no longer apply to Christians. So when they become Christians, they're now free to eat whatever they want to eat. But if you were a Jew and you became a Christian, you're used to the old ways, is that going to bother you? Absolutely. In fact, it might bother you so much that you tell every other Christian they shouldn't eat those things. How are you Christians eating that meat sacrificed to idols? What in the world are you doing eating meat that's not kosher? So what's going on in Rome, most likely it's occasioning this letter, is that Paul has Jews that have converted to Christianity and they're hanging on to the old ways and aren't willing to give them up. And they're taking that standard and they're forcing it on their Gentile brothers and sisters and saying, you got to follow these food laws too. That is the type of thing going on. And here's what Paul's saying, is that that kind of person is the weaker brother or the weaker sister, if you will. They are a person who thinks something's wrong, but it really isn't. Now, this is the definition of disputable matters. And I want to make a clarification again, because this is such a misunderstood topic. And you can see I've written it at the end of that first little point A. Paul is, again, not dealing with issues that are really wrong. Think about it for a moment. If someone would have come along after Paul wrote the letter of Romans and said, you know what, I really think justification isn't by faith alone, but is by works. Paul wouldn't say, well, that's a disputable matter. Let's just all love each other and forget about it, not argue. No, Paul wouldn't do that at all. Paul would say, no, that's absolutely wrong thinking. We are saved by grace alone, through faith alone, and not by works. And he would refute that vigorously. In fact, he does in another letter called Galatians. Paul has lots of things that he's very firm on, okay? Things that are wrong. There's a letter to the Corinthians where it's discovered that there's sexual immorality going on in Corinth. And Paul doesn't say, well, it's a disputable matter. Can't judge you. No, Paul does. He says, look, that's wrong. Stop it. Okay? So once again, to be clear, what we're talking about here isn't things that the Bible actually forbids. The Bible actually forbids it. You have a right as a Christian to bring that up and say the Bible forbids this. Paul's talking about people who think the Bible forbids something, but it really doesn't. Okay? So this is the narrow sliver of issue we're dealing with. Now, you might think that's a pretty minor issue, but it isn't. Here's the reality. In churches all across the land, I would venture to say a high proportion of our disputes are actually over things that fit this category. Over things that the Bible doesn't say yay or nay to, that is a little bit open, and yet people fight over them. So I just want to make that very clear. When we're talking about disputable matters here, that's the issue Paul is dealing with. Now, what are some examples of this? Look at point B. He does give some examples of the disputable matters. I've hinted at these, but let's look a little more closely at them. First is this food issue. Look at verse 2. One person believes he may eat anything, while the weak person eats only vegetables. Now, for those who are vegetarians, you might think, hey, look, vegetarianism is in the Bible. Look, this proves my point, right? Of course, he does call you the weaker brother, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. Now, for those of you who are thinking this is vegetarianism, it's got nothing to do with modern vegetarianism. What he's talking about here with the food issue is the one I just brought up a moment ago. Most likely, there's Jewish Christians in Rome who don't feel comfortable eating the meat served to them because it hasn't been properly prepared in a kosher way according to Old Testament purity laws. And so they say, you can't eat that kind of meat. And all the Gentiles are gobbling it up. And so those Jews are saying, you Gentiles are wrong for eating that meat. And Paul's stepping in and going, no, that's not true. It's not wrong, but that's the weaker brother who thinks it should be wrong. And so therefore, they're refraining from eating the meat, and they're only eating vegetables. This is an example of a disputable matter. And Paul's stepping in and saying, this is what the weaker brother thinks. They're bothered by this. Remember my line a minute ago? They're overly sensitive. They're bothered by this, and you just have to realize they're the weaker brother. They think something's wrong when it really isn't. Here's a second example that Paul gives. Certain days honored above others. Look at verse 5. One person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Now, it's pretty clear what's going on here. I want you to think about the Sabbath day for a moment. In the Old Testament, what day did people observe the Sabbath on? Saturday, right? And in the New Testament, of course, due to the resurrection of Christ and the practice of the early church, what is the day they observe in the New Testament? Sunday. So if you're a Jew who's been Saturday your whole life, and you become a Christian, right, and now everything's on Sunday, what might they still want to do? Set aside that prior day. And then they look at all their fellow Gentile believers and say, hey, you're not setting aside Saturday. You're wrong. You should set it aside too. I honor that day. You ought to honor it too. And Paul steps in and goes, well, actually not true. The Sabbath day was appropriate in the Old Testament context, but in the New, that's no longer an issue. Now we worship on Sunday, and the people are bothered by it. That is a second example of the person who's the weaker brother, who thinks something's wrong, but it really isn't. Now, let me give you a third example. And this I'm stealing from next week, but I think it's appropriate to bring up. Look at the third example there. Some refrain from drinking wine. Now you're thinking, wow, I know where he's going with this. If you look ahead, and we're going to look at this next week, verse 21. He brings up the similar issue again. It is good not to eat meat or drink wine or do anything that causes your brother to stumble. What he's hinting at here is that some people are bothered by the drinking of wine, and therefore if you drink it, it causes them to stumble. And if that's true, Paul says, and we'll look at this next week, he says, you can willingly refrain from doing it in order to help your weaker brother, okay, who finds it problematic. But notice the example here. Drinking wine is not a sin, okay? Drinking wine is not a problem. Some people think it is, but Paul's very clear that it isn't, okay? The weaker brother thinks it's a problem when it really isn't. Now, by the way, drunkenness is a sin, okay? That's a separate issue Paul's not addressing here. But simply drinking wine is not a sin. But why would people be opposed to drinking wine? Again, most likely it's a Jewish Christian thing. They think that the wine that's typically served in Rome is what's been offered as a libation to the gods, okay? And that was true. Actually, meat and wine and other things would be offered as honorary to the gods. And after it had been offered as an honorary tribute to the gods, they would sell the wine in the marketplace. So you would buy wine in the marketplace, and it had been given as a tribute to the gods, and some people may be bothered by this, think you can't drink that wine, it's been tribute to the gods. Paul says, actually, you can. Those gods aren't real anyway. You can drink that wine, but if it bothers your brother, you have to realize that's the weaker person. They think it's a sin, but it really isn't. Okay, now you're getting a feel for what's going on here, right? There's these controversies, and you can see this would split a body and tear it apart. The weaker brother is the person who thinks something's a sin and isn't. Now, what about modern examples? Now it's getting sticky. I thought it this week as like, you know what, I ought to open it up for discussion and think what people think modern examples are. And I said, I may never get it back after that. If I were just to throw the gates wide open, I'd have people saying everything. So I'm going to give you a few things I think are modern examples, and then we'll try to contain this. What's interesting about disputable matters is there's actually some dispute over what is a disputable matter. I think that's obvious. And that makes life a little complicated. The point is, I think we can come up with modern illustrations, okay? Now, by the way, these are just modern analogies. They're not exactly the same that Paul is dealing with. He's dealing with a very precise issue, but I think if we were to ask the question, what are some people think's a sin that isn't, I think we could come up with modern examples. I just mentioned one, which is the drinking of wine, okay? Some people in the Christian world today think if you take a sip of alcohol, you are sinning. The Bible doesn't condemn that. The Bible actually has Paul encouraging Timothy to drink wine at one point. Okay, we know Jesus drank wine at the Lord's Supper. We know that there was wine at the wedding of Cana. Okay, drunkenness is widely condemned, but simply having wine isn't. But in our culture, you're going to run across people who think the drinking of wine is a sin, and guess what? They're going to tell you it's a sin, and they're going to hold that standard to you. That would be a good example in the modern day of a weaker brother insisting something's wrong when it isn't. And you know what? That splits churches. And we're going to talk about how to deal with it in a moment. I haven't gotten how to deal with it. We're just talking about what it is, right? Now, let me give you a second example, I think, in the modern day of this sort of thing. And you could come up with 100 of these, okay? Where do you send your kids to school? We had a forum at my church a few years ago on homeschooling versus public schooling versus private Christian schooling and which option you should take. Now, we had this forum, and before the forum even happened, I had people come up to me already convinced that I was going to argue against their particular choice of school, right? So I had public school parents coming up and go, you're going to bang on public schools, aren't you? I had homeschoolers come to me and saying, you're going to go after homeschoolers, aren't you? And I'm like, no, actually, none of that's true. What we pointed out in my church, interestingly, is that parents have freedom in the educational choices. They have to be wise about this, okay? And there's all kinds of factors that make this complicated. I'm not assuming it's easy. It's complicated. But there's legitimate options for Christians in all three categories, okay? And what's interesting about my church is that all our pastoral staff have made different choices. Our senior pastor sends his kid to public school. One of our associate pastors, actually two of our associate pastors, homeschool their kids. And I send my kids to a Christian school. Yet we're all in the same church staff. Now imagine if one came in and go, you know what, if you don't homeschool, you're in sin. You can say that, okay, but you can see the fracturing that would cause. Some people are bothered so much, they would almost think that if you don't homeschool, you're not really doing what God wants you to do. This is the kind of thing Paul's talking about even in the modern day. And that can cause all kinds of struggles. And right, people think it's a sin, but it isn't to send your kid to a Christian school or even to a public school. And there's complications in all those options, right, that you have to be wise about. But this is another possible example of these things. I could add others. How about the way you dress at church? What do you have to wear when you show up on Sunday? Tie and coat? Shorts and flip-flops? Everywhere in between? Does it bother you when people show up a certain way at church and not another? Now, I admit that there's social graces involved here, right? And I admit there's wisdom involved here, but the Bible just doesn't tell you how to dress in church, okay? How about the music instrument you play in church? Now, have you ever been to a church where you got the impression that if you played an instrument other than a piano, you're probably in sin, okay, or an organ? Or then you got the opposite problem, right? Whereas if you play a piano or an older instrument, you're probably in sin, right? You got churches just fighting with each other about instrumentation issues like this. We could go on and on here. The Bible doesn't tell you what instruments to use in worship. But some people think that the Bible does. And they enforce that rule on everybody else. That is what is meant by judging somebody. It's by taking a standard that's not in the Bible, but just is yours, and putting it on somebody. That is judging. Okay, this is the situation. Now, how do you handle it? Flip your notes over. Let's talk about what Paul lays this out here. You can see how practical this is. There's just, I think of all the sections here in 12 through 16, this might be one of the most practical. It's just so nuts and bolts, core, base, common sense stuff that you just have to deal with. So how do you deal with this sort of issue? Well, three things. Let's start with the very first one, and that is accept one another. Notice verse 1 for a moment. As for the one who is weak in faith, welcome him. This is very key that Paul says. If you come across a brother that is weak in their faith, they think something's a sin and isn't, he doesn't say, well, lay into him, right? Bust his chops. Show him the Bible doesn't forbid it, Lay out your best exegetical case. Now, Paul's not forbidding discussion here. But what does he say? Look, you got a weaker brother here. He's bothered by something. And you need to accept him and welcome him. Don't let this be a reason to split, okay? So the first application I want you to see here is that Paul goes, when it comes to these disputable matters, don't go your separate ways over them. Don't split over them. Now, by the way, as a clarification, again, I'm going to do this the whole time, by the way, because it's so easily misunderstood. There are times when you have to go separate ways, when there's things that are so wrong and so problematic or false teaching or false actions, you do have to say, yeah, I'm not going to be a part of that. But that's, again, not what Paul's talking about, right? He's not talking about things that really are wrong. He's talking about disputable things, which means that someone thinks they're wrong and they're not. That type of person, you welcome them in. And so there's a welcomingness here. Now, notice what he says right after that. I love this. But not to quarrel over opinions. You ever had someone that you got together with and you thought, oh, wow, they're letting bygones be bygones, and they're welcoming me into their home, and we sit down, but you realize it's just this sort of ruse to get you in there to pound away on you about their view, right? So notice what Paul says. He goes, welcome them, but not just to fight more, okay? Not just as an opportunity to quarrel more, okay? You be looking for peace here. By the way, this is a great example of what Paul says. You can look for peace here because there's nothing at stake that really is true or false, right? This is a person who's confused. And so therefore, you can look for peace here because it's not something that's a critical matter. Okay? Whether you drink wine or not is not going to be the critical matter. It's not like salvation by works or salvation by faith. So Paul says, look, you can accept them. Let's talk about that for a moment. What might it look like in your life practically to accept somebody who thinks you're wrong and that you're in sin when you're really not, but they think you are? And here's why I do open it up for comments. What would it look like to be welcoming to a person like that? Paul says, welcome them. What might that include? Yep. Yeah. So, in other words, there is a kindness that is entirely legitimate there, right? You ever get in a dispute with someone where suddenly it's just war and you're an enemy and you're just going... Paul says, no, show them kindness. That would be a way to welcome them. What would be another example? Yep, Tony? Okay, just be together, right? Well, and this is almost exactly what Paul's getting at here. Welcome them in such a way that you're not just using it as another opportunity to fight, but just be in fellowship with them. No doubt the term here, welcome, has probably all kinds of hospitality dimensions to it, okay? And so what Paul's probably even referring to is then having them in for a meal. Now, in the ancient world, this was a big deal. When you think about getting a meal with someone, it's casual, doesn't really have much meaning. In the ancient world, it had tremendous meaning. To have a meal with someone means that we're in fellowship. We're in community. We're together, right? We're on the same team is what a meal would be. So to welcome someone like that disagrees with you, that would be a very key example of the kind of welcoming that Paul has. So there's a dispositional issue here that Paul says that should be marking the faith. So the striving point here is one for unity. Paul says, look, do whatever you can to maintain the unity and peace. But it's the second way that's really critical. Look at point B. And this is where Paul gets to the heart of it. Here's the main way you handle this, is you don't go around judging or despising one another. And I want you to notice here that Paul actually picks the word judge and despise very, very carefully. And if you didn't notice it, I want you to look very careful with me and see where he does this, because he does this very carefully. Look down again at verse 3. Let not the one who eats, that's the strong brother, despise the one who abstains, that's the weaker brother. And let not the one who abstains, the weaker brother, pass judgment on the one who eats. And then notice the same thing comes up in verse 10. Look at verse 10. Why do you pass judgment on your brother, or why do you despise your brother? Notice he uses two words here, judgment and despise. Okay, and here's where he's going. For the weaker brother, he says don't judge. And for the stronger brother, he says don't despise. And let's just take those one at a time and talk about them as we go. First, the strong. You can see that first little bullet point. Those who understand their freedom in Christ are called not to despise. In other words, let me just put it this way. If you have someone that you're dealing with who thinks what you're doing is wrong, but it's really not wrong, how do you handle them? Well, Paul recognizes the temptation is to despise them, to look down on them, to regard them as silly and uninformed and ignorant, to be condescending to them, to kind of like, it's the pat on the head. You don't really understand, you silly little Christian. You're so immature. Pat, pat, pat. What I'm doing isn't really wrong. You think it's wrong, but you're just silly, ignorant, and foolish, and I'm going to pat you on the head in a condescending way and kind of scoot you along. That's despising somebody. And Paul says, you might be right theologically. This is key. You might be right. It may not be a sin, this thing they're bothered by. But that doesn't mean you mistreat them. You need to treat them with gentleness and courtesy, not looking down on them, but patient with them. So the analogy I want to give you here is if you have an immature Christian, which is what the weaker Christian is, who thinks something's wrong that isn't, you need to sort of just deal gently with them. Realize that they're like a younger believer who just don't fully understand, but you don't condescend for that reason. You rather try to bring them along and help them. An analogy I thought of this week on this is the way I look at the way my two daughters relate. My oldest daughter's 15, she's Emma, and my youngest daughter's Kate, and she's 9. And Kate's a lot younger than Emma, and Kate's a lot more immature than Emma, and certain things bother her that don't bother Emma. She has certain things she demands that Emma wouldn't demand. Watching my older daughter deal with my younger daughter is actually a good example of this. She doesn't look at the younger daughter and go, "You're an idiot, you're foolish, why do you get bothered by these things?" You know what she does? She's patient with her. She's gentle with her. You know why? Because she knows she's younger. She knows she's more immature. Just be patient. If you have a person in your life that is telling you you're doing something wrong when you're not wrong, the solution isn't to pound them, right? It's just to recognize they're the younger, weaker Christian. I should be patient and gentle. Was God not patient with me? Is God not gentle with me? Then I can be gentle with them. I'll give you another illustration. This is just an illustration, but a way to capture this. Let's imagine you're going on a trip. You and a friend decide to go on a vacation together, just the two of you. And you're going to fly down some resort in Florida and have a nice week. And your friend, you discover before you leave, is afraid to fly. And they're convinced that flying is the most dangerous thing in the world, and the plane's going to crash, and they're notoriously unreliable, the mechanics don't know what they're doing, and so on and so forth. And you're thinking, wow, that describes me. I kind of think that, right? Maybe you're one of those people that's afraid to fly. And you realize your friend's fear of flying is going to ruin your whole trip, because now you got to be in a car 12 hours down to wherever the resort is, and you're like, come on. You try to convince your friend, look, you're being silly, you're being immature, you're being foolish. Flying's the safest thing in the world. Don't you realize these people have a great track record? You're uninformed. Now, you could go down that whole path, okay? But what are you dealing with in a situation like that? Someone who's just genuinely scared to fly. Is it reasonable? No. Is it rational? No. Is it correct technically? No. But they're scared. And in one sense, you could say they're the weaker brother. What would you do in a situation like that? Would you pound them with evidence and statistics about the safety of flying and then ridicule them for their fear of flying? You're just dumb. That's silly. Who's scared of that? Why would you do that? No, you wouldn't do that. What would you do? Well, what you should do is gently realize they're the weaker brother. Okay, we'll drive. Now, are they right about flying? No. Flying's safer than driving. But what do? You don't despise them. You're gentle with them. You don't cancel the trip. You don't go your separate ways. You don't call them an idiot. Okay? This is a disputable matter, and you're willing to concede in the situation where it's a disputable matter. You notice what that illustration captures is think about the peace that would create in your vacation. Is it more inconvenient to drive all that way? Yes. But think about the peace that creates in your vacation over a matter that doesn't really matter. Okay? This is Paul's point. If you find yourself in the stronger position, don't despise. Be gentle and patient. Now, what happens if you're in the weaker position? Now, of course, the truth is no one thinks they're in the weaker position, right? What if you're in the weaker position? Look at the second thing. The weak who abstain from certain practices are called to not pass judgment. Notice the language difference here. Paul's very specific here. One is don't despise, and one is don't pass judgment. Paul's very clear. Don't go around judging. Why is he use the term judgment here? And this is what he really means by don't judge, okay? What he's getting at here is when you do that, what you're doing is you're acting on your own authority. You're saying, I don't happen to like this practice. The Bible doesn't forbid it, remember. I don't happen to like this practice, and since I don't happen to like this practice, I'm going to condemn everybody who does it. Well, that is judging, okay, in all the right ways. That's not the way the world understands the term judge. Remember, we already talked about that. They think that anytime you tell someone wrong, you're judging. That's not what Paul's doing here. But if you act on your own authority, create your own standard, and then go around telling people they should follow it, that is being judgmental, okay? And I want you to notice how Paul says this here, because it's very important how he does it. Look down at verse 3 and 4 again. He says again, let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats, for God has welcomed him. Notice this next line in verse 4. Who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another? It is before his own master that he stands or falls, and he will be upheld, for the Lord is able to uphold him. Here's what Paul's getting at. When you judge someone over a disputable matter, a matter the Bible does not condemn, you're acting on your own authority. You're acting like they're your servant and that you're the master. And what Paul's saying is, no, they have their master, God. They don't answer to you. They answer to God. So if you go around judging people for behaviors that aren't really wrong just because you don't like them, that is acting like you're the Lord. And that's what judgment really means. If you want to know what it means to judge somebody, it means to uphold your own private standard and insist it, or impose it on them and insist they follow it. And by the way, people all over the world and churches today do that. Okay? And you know what? And people in Jesus' day did that. Who are the people in Jesus' day that created their own standards and insisted everyone follow them? Pharisees. This person, when they do that, is acting like a Pharisee. And here's the essence of what they're doing. Here's the big takeaway. When a person judges another person for something the Bible doesn't speak to, they are adding to the Word of God. They are saying, well, the Bible says X, but I really want this other thing to be forbidden too, so I'm going to add that in there. And then I'm going to hold everyone accountable to it. Paul's point is a really simple one. Don't add to God's Word. When you hold your brother and sister accountable, you hold them accountable to what's actually in there. Okay? That you can hold them accountable to. So here's a scenario I want you to think about. Okay? You find out your friend is having an affair. And you say, well, I really shouldn't judge. No, you've misunderstood the passage. Your friend is in serious sin. You go to them and you confront them. Why? Because the Bible condemns adultery. And you're not doing that on your authority, right? You're doing that on the Bible's authority. But let's imagine your friend has a glass of wine at dinner. And then you say, hey, you should really not do that. Now what are you doing? Now actually you're leaving what the Bible says and you're coming up with your own standard, your own private judgment. Those are the two scenarios I want you to see. If your friend's in adultery, you should go confront them because it's not your authority you're basing it on, it's God's. If your person's drinking a glass of wine and you confront them, guess whose authority is now in play? Yours. And guess what? They're not your servant. You're not their master. They have a different master, namely God. They shouldn't answer to you, they answer to God. That's what Paul just said. Don't go around judging. They have their own master. To their own master, they're going to stand or fall. Now, you know what questions come in application here. Look at the key question under B. Who are you despising or passing judgment on today? Now, this implies that you know whether you're the weak or strong person, but you know something? I think we kind of do. Who do you look down upon because they just don't have the maturity to know about what's right or wrong about certain things? Right? The person who's afraid to fly, do you just mock them? Or do you have your own little private standards that you admit that they really are, and you just want to go around and just impose them on everybody else, and you just look down at everyone who doesn't follow your rules? I can tell you this, the reason Paul addresses all this, because if people behave like this, if everyone's always despising and judging, what's going to happen to a church? It's going to blow up, okay? And truthfully, that's what's happened to churches all around the country, is that there's denominations and splits and fights and arguments. Now, sometimes they're legitimate over real things, right? But then if they're over disputable things that don't really matter like this, that is the tragedy. Paul's point is simple. Don't let a church split over that. Don't let a friendship break over that. Just if you're the stronger brother, just concede. Drive in the car instead of fly, right? Just be gentle and patient. And if you're the person who's weak, don't go around imposing your standard on others. You can keep it if you want to. You don't have to drink wine. But you can't go around telling everyone else they can't, okay? And this is where Paul is making his point. Now notice the third and final way to handle this, okay? First was you got to be welcoming to one another. Second, you don't judge or despise. But third, look at point C. When it comes to disputable matters, focus on your own behavior rather than others. This is when I love Paul here multiple times basically says, you need to just think about yourself. And this is where I couldn't help but thinking what we tell kids, right? When they're growing up, when we discipline them as parents. It's like, you worry about you, right? Don't worry about your sister. I can tell you all the times. I go, tell the kids to clean their room, right? And they're up there, and then one of my kids will run down and go, so-and-so's not doing and you're like, look, are you cleaning your room? Well, actually, no. And so I'm like, maybe you just ought to focus on you. Okay, here's what Paul does in this last point. He actually says, you know what you need to be thinking about in regard to disputable matters. I got to say it again. If your friend's committing adultery, you don't just say, well, I just need to think about me. No, that's something that is really wrong. You need to go deal with that. But when it comes to disputable matters, just you need to focus on you, okay, and not worry about nitpicking everybody else. I want to ask you this question. Are you the kind of person that always is watching, looking, noticing, paying attention to how everyone else does everything? And not really thinking about how you're doing it, but just kind of always looking at somebody else? Or do you know someone like that? What do you think a person's life is like who always is looking over their shoulder at how everybody else is doing it? That's a real question. What do you think that person's life is like when they're not thinking about themselves? They're always looking at everybody else. What do you think that person's life is like? Or what do you think they're like? I hear whispers of it. No one wants to say it, right? They're miserable. Why? Yeah, they become the police of everybody else's life. Good luck with that, right? How's that going to go? Also, when you're always comparing yourself, you're perpetually dissatisfied, frustrated, end up comparing yourself to everyone else. Look, when it comes to disputable matters, remember, we're talking about just those, let it go. Focus on how you're doing, okay? If you don't want to drink wine, don't drink wine. If you want to do a certain activity, like observe a certain day, fine. Just don't impose it on others. There's a sense in which Paul takes this and says, look, you just focus on you. And what you do, make sure you do it out of faith. I want you to look at the way he says this. Look at verse 5. One person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. Notice that language. Be convinced in your mind that what you're doing is right. Don't go around policing everybody else over these things. I put a little sub-point there. In other words, if you're doubtful about a behavior, don't do it. If you're confused about whether a behavior is good or bad and you have doubts and your conscience isn't clear, this is going to come up next week, by the way, don't do it, okay? And Paul's very clear to make sure your conscience is clear about this. And then he says in verse 6 a very similar thing. The one who observes this day, observe it in the honor of the Lord. The one who eats, eat in honor of the Lord. In other words, whatever you're doing, either way, do it in honor of the Lord. Just focus on your relationship with Christ. In all this, realize verse 10 at the very end. Listen to this last line. For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God. God will adjudicate all this in the end. We just really need to be thinking about our own selves and not nitpicking everybody else over disputable matters, but rather focusing on our own lives. If you're worried about whether someone dresses a certain way or whether they drink wine or not, or whether they homeschool their kids or send them to public school, Paul's advice to you is kind of simple, which is just do what your conscience is telling you to do on these issues and be faithful to him and realize that God is the judge of all these things, and these things will be settled under his rule. If this is followed, I can tell you this would be a sweeping level of peace in the church, okay? Now, I'll say it for the 75th time. This doesn't mean that when there's things that are really wrong, we ignore them, okay? That's not, again, what Paul's talking about. He's talking about disputable matters, things the Bible's not saying one way or the other on. Those things, let it go and focus on your own heart and life. I think this is one of the most interesting passages in Romans. In fact, it's so important that Paul's going to extend this next week because it's so practical. So as we close it out, I want you to think about someone right now that you're not getting along with over an issue like this. Now, I'm not talking about whether you get along with them over, like, who does the carpool, okay? I'm talking about whether you don't get along with them over a matter that's disagreeable like these. Maybe it's someone who does the schooling thing or drinks wine. Are you the weaker or the stronger? It doesn't matter. The point is Paul wants you to seek peace in the midst of those disputable matters. And there's nothing more practical than that in the body of Christ. Okay, a lot to talk about in our groups. You can see the 3 questions there at the bottom. And let me encourage you as you go into groups, be honest. No one wants to be the weaker brother. Let's just put that on the table. It'd be really easy to get in a group and go, yeah, I got a lot of weak people around me. Let me tell you, it's a burden to deal with them. I want you to pray for me today. Give me grace with all these weaker brothers. Now, I want you to go into this today and be honest. Truthfully, we're all a mix. In some issues, we're the stronger brother. In some issues, we're the weaker brother. You need to own that. Who you judging today about these issues that you need to stop judging? Okay, that's the big thing I want you to be honest about in your groups. So let's do that. Let me pray as we transition to those. Lord, we're grateful for this word. We need to hear it. Lord, we're all weak in some ways and strong in others. Forgive us, Lord, for our fighting. And Lord, help us to be at peace with one another in the body of Christ. And bless now these conversations about this, we pray in Christ's name. Amen.